right. Maybe the crowd isn't so big because tomorrow's the Super Bowl and probably everybody is out there buying all their stuff for tomorrow. But it's kind of appropriate that what I want to talk about in the Super Bowl go together, because tomorrow we will be annoyed over and over again with the huge number of commercials that are going to interrupt the game. And of course, where did all this come from? Of course, media and commercials first came together with radio. But the interesting thing about that was, though, it was not obvious. Even Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover said that radio should not be commercial because a presidential speech could be sandwiched between two patent medicine ads, and he didn't think that was appropriate. But we know that eventually, of course, radio did become commercial, but it did take a while, and it was not without opposition and without controversy. Oops, too far. All right, so and another interesting thing about radio, I think, is there are some interesting parallels with the internet. Again, how do we pay for the internet? Through ads, pop-up ads, commercialism. In fact, commercialism, right, is the way we run all our media. It's not like we had to do that. There are other alternatives to it. The other interesting thing about both radio and the internet, the technology was in place before anybody knew what to do with it. And particularly with the internet, the government, the Defense Department builds this system to connect a couple of university computers together, and like nobody used it. But the guys, the young computer engineered guys who had access to this system, they started creating little groups to talk about the Grateful Dead or to talk about science fiction. And then, of course, there's this guy named Ray Tomlinson who came up with the idea of email, right? Which then, was really the first way that the internet really took off. And of course, the other aspect is that both radio and the internet have had political impacts, probably not anticipated when the media first developed. And of course, I just want to give a shout out here to our exhibit over here about Edwin Armstrong, the great independent inventor who really made radio broadcasting, the radio industry possible with his invention of a vacuum tube that you could use for broadcasting, and also his development of tuning circuits so you could actually tune in a radio. Now, when we think of Thomas Edison, we always think of the light bulb, right? But what isn't as well known as maybe the most important thing that Thomas Edison ever did, and God knows why he did it. He stuck a wire into a light bulb in 1883, and guess what he found? He found there was a current. And there wasn't, the electron hadn't even been discovered yet. He didn't know what the heck was going on. But this is the beginning of all electronics. And I always wonder, what if Edison hadn't done that experiment? Would we not have any computers? Would we not have any transistors? Was electronics somehow intuitively obvious that somebody else would have discovered it? Of course, we don't know, because all we know is what happened. But we do know that Edison's experiment did lead to the development of the key technology for radio, the vacuum tube. And of course, what you have here, it's basically a light bulb, right? And when it's operating through a vacuum, it sends out a stream of electrons. And if you put a charged plate on it, those electrons will stream over to the plate. Of course, the next big step in the technology that really turned a vacuum tube was to put another, in between the light bulb and that plate, you put in another circuit, which then can be used to modify the current flowing across. You can then amplify currents. You can also use this as a switch to turn on and off. And that's it. I mean, that's all electronics is. I mean, that's all our computers are. Our whole complex system of the world is based on a basically simple physical phenomena that was first demonstrated in the vacuum tube. Okay, now, the early history of radio is really a mess. There were these competing companies, all of whom had patents from the different people who were involved. Our buddy Armstrong had sold his patents to Westinghouse. AT&T had the patents of Lee DeForest, and GE had a patent by Irving Langmuir. It's one of the most bizarre things in history. Lee DeForest built a vacuum tube, a physical vacuum tube in 1907 and patented it, but it wouldn't work because he didn't understand the principle. Irving Langmuir at GE got that thing, pumped all the air out of it so that it was a vacuum, and it worked. And so that's why GE had a position here, because Langmuir. But it's so strange that DeForest built the right device, but he thought it was based on ionized gas inside the light bulb, which was wrong. And then all Langmuir had to do was pump out the air, and the darn thing worked like a charm. So what you had was a patent mess. During World War I, radio turned out to be rather useful. And after the war, these companies, the United States formed RCA. We basically forced the Marconi Company, which was British, to give up all their American patents to us. They owed us several $billion after the war, so we had a little bit of leverage over the British. So GE created this thing called the Radio Corporation of America, and so they came up with this incredibly complex agreement. AT&T, of course, thought that radio was going to be used for wireless telephony. GE and Westinghouse were basically electrical manufacturers who wanted to sell radio sets. But the interesting thing was, this agreement was signed in 1920, and it does not include broadcasting. They didn't have any idea about what the heck radio was actually going to be used for. They thought it might be used for, for individual people, more like an internet. Individual people talking to each other. And one of the fun things you could do was they called them distance feeds. Because at night, right, radio signals will go very far at night. In fact, when I was a kid, a teenager, and I wanted to find out what the latest rock and roll songs, I listened to WBZ in Boston. I listened to a station in Cleveland. I listened to a station in Chicago that you could pick up at night.
So that was because they were using the lower frequencies at that time. They thought that the higher frequencies would be useless. Shortwave. So shortwave is better in the day.
Yeah.
And the lower frequencies are better at night.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so that's what they thought. But then the Westinghouse Company in Pittsburgh just decided, hey, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if we just broadcast something? And so they started broadcasting things, and guess what they found out? People loved it. People wanted it, and they wanted more, and they wanted more. And so in the 1920s, broadcasting really took off, but it was totally a disorganized industry. There were hundreds and hundreds of small local radio stations, and a lot of them, like a furniture store, would have a radio station. And basically a lot of these very small local radio stations were set up just kind of to promote the person who was running the radio station. And of course, there's a problem here that it actually cost some money to run a radio station, and they weren't getting any revenue. So that kind of became a bit of a problem. And again, broadcasting was still seen throughout much of the 20s, the 1920s. Broadcasting wasn't really deemed as critically important to the industry, because what they really wanted to do was sell radios. And of course, because, in the 1920s, it's really quite remarkable, the growth of this industry. In 1922, 100,000 radios were sold for a value of $5 million. In 1924, 2 years later, 1.5 million radios were sold with a value of $100 million. In 1929, 4.5 million radios were sold for a value of $600 million. I mean, this industry just explodes. And basically the idea is that GE and Westinghouse, and their broadcasting is there to sell radios. But of course, at some point, right, everybody's got a radio. And once everybody's got a radio, then what's broadcasting for? And one of the interesting, what could you possibly use radio for? And one of the interesting things was public service. And one of my favorite ones was the United States Department of Agriculture came up with a program in the middle 20s called Aunt Sammy, who was Uncle Sam's wife. And what Aunt Sammy did was they broadcast helpful, modern information basically out to the rural America, to the farm wives. And what they would do is they would send out the scripts and then they would get a local woman to actually read the script on the radio so the accent was right? So that the person listening to it would think it was a neighbor who was talking to them. Here's a typical program. Recited a stanza of doggerel verse, told several jokes, and explained how to select and care for linoleum for the kitchen floor, directed how to roast weenies the modern way, how to use vinegar left over from a jar of pickles, and how to put up cucumber relish. Defined what a vitamin was, enumerated the 5 foods essential to the daily diet, listed what foods should be taken from dishes with fingers, and ended up offering the menu for the day: meatloaf with brown gravy, scalloped potatoes, carrots or beets, fresh sliced tomatoes, and lemon jello dessert. Well, it's really kind of interesting. Now, I don't know if these farm wives were insulted that, they knew how to cook, right? They knew what to make, and yet here's this friendly neighbor, I guess, telling them this is the modern way. This is what we know more about food. And another idea about radio was that it could be used for cultural uplift. We could now get, we could take the best of high culture, and everybody could have access to high culture. You could put operas on the radio, right? And one of the most important here was Toscanini and his orchestra on the NBC network, providing classical music for Americans. But then funny things happened on the way. People found out that they really liked other kinds of music, and one of the most important ones was Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman, who was the father of country music. And what was really interesting too is that his country music was incredibly popular in the cities. And I guess because of a lot of people had just come from the country, there was a big migration from the countryside to the cities in this era, and people were feeling a little nostalgic for their past life. And so country music became incredibly popular. And of course, the other incredibly popular music of the 1920s and 30s, big band music. And one of the interesting the way this music kind of got on the radio was that one of the biggest problems that early broadcasters had was, how do you fill up all these hours? I mean, radio, there was one famous thing where the guy stuck his microphone out the window and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's the sound of New York traffic." It was very demanding to fill up. So one of the things they would do late at night is they would just go to a ballroom. And they would just these big bands would be playing in ballrooms. And of course, the music became incredibly popular, promoting this popular music. Now, advertising. As I pointed out before, there was a lot of skepticism that advertising would not work on the radio. And that radio was not the proper place for advertising. In fact, the early days, the type of advertising was very much like we have on NPR today. This fine program was brought to you by the good folks down at the local hardware store. It was just kind of institutional ads. Now, one of the first breakthroughs here was a little bit more commercial-oriented advertising. And it's interesting, WAEF in New York was an AT&T station. And because of the legal agreement between the various companies, they claimed that they were the only ones that could sell airtime. That no other radio station legally was allowed to sell airtime in the early 1920s. And so WAEF pioneered. And one of the most popular time-bought ads was the Click-Clee, or
Clico.
Anybody know French? What's that?
Clico.
What is it?
The Clico.
The Clico Club Eskimo Band. And so and what they really did, they kind of embedded, of course, they embedded the name of the ginger ale in the name of the band. And so they thought, okay, this is an okay kind of advertising. We're providing people entertainment. The advertising is not too intrusive. And this became kind of a model for advertising in the early years. And of course, one of the biggest things that happens in radio in the 1920s is the form of wired national networks. The two of them, NBC and Columbia. And what they did is, AT&T basically decided that they're going to get out of the radio business. And so what they did was they made a deal with these guys that they would pay a huge amount of money to AT&T to send their stuff over the wires. And of course, this also creates a monopoly, right? Nobody else can break into this system. In fact, right, NBC had two networks, the red and the blue, one of which became ABC. So if you think about the major networks that went into television, the three networks that dominated American media were the three that were basically formed in the 1920s for radio. And of course, the question, one of the big questions still was, can you sell on radio? Is radio an appropriate medium for getting people to buy things? Now, one industry that went into radio advertising early was the candy industry. The candy industry was shifting to branded products from what had been, I guess, taking candy out of a barrel. And so the industry wasn't sure that branded products were going to work. This was going to be a risky thing to do anyway. So they said, well, we might as well take another risk. So let's put it on the radio. And one of the early ones was the Betty Jane Candy Company, who began to advertise on the radio, and it worked. Sales went way up. It became a very popular kind of candy. Probably the biggest thing supporting radio advertising was the fight to the death battle between Lucky Strike and Camels to be the #1 cigarette brand in the country. They spent huge amounts of money on advertising and radio to promote each other's product. Of course, what were they going to be advertising? And of course, they were going to be advertising increasingly lots of radio shows. And this was very interesting too, because radio shows were expensive to put together, and still the revenue situation wasn't all that good for a lot of the radio stations, even on the networks. But another phenomenon that we have in the 1920s is the growth of the modern advertising agencies, who are advertising in lots of media, magazines, right, newspapers, and they start to then think that the advertising agencies, at first they're skeptical, but the ad agencies start to think that, well, maybe we could sell on the radio. But what they increasingly start to do is they produce the whole thing. They produce the content. They actually, they write the scripts, they hire the actors, they sometimes embed commercials in the middle of the script. So radio becomes increasingly commercial in the 1920s, and particularly in the 1930s. And of course, what also happens in the 1930s, in the early days, like with the Eskimo Club, radio performers were anonymous because the advertisers did not want the audience to be distracted by the name of the star. But by the 1930s, this began to change. Rudy Valley, and of course the other thing in the 1930s is that a lot of people are now coming from vaudeville. In the 1920s, vaudeville was thought of kind of crass. A lot of the jokes might not have been appropriate for a broader audience. Of course, there was a lot of ethnic and racial humor in vaudeville that, again, they thought maybe not appropriate for a national audience. But vaudeville wasn't doing well in the 1930s, and a lot of vaudeville performers moved over into radio, and also some of the major singers like Rudy Valley turned over. Of course, perhaps the biggest vaudeville star, of course, Eddie Cantor, who brought ethnic Jewish humor to the radio, and it turned out that people really liked it. Because I should have had to say, of course, Amos and Andy became, two white men who acted like they were black New York City cab drivers, became absolutely the most popular radio show there ever was. It had an enormous audience. So radio, they found out, well, we can deal with ethnic and racial issues as long as it's not as long as some of the more crass aspects that you would have heard in vaudeville were left out. Now, they said not everybody was excited about what had happened to radio in the 1930s. There had been a lot of idealism in the 1920s, cultural uplift, educating people. Radio could be a great educating, we can put programs on here that can educate people. Even people living in small towns in the middle of nowhere can now have access to high culture, to all kinds of, of educational things. But by the 1930s, there really started to be a big backlash, a significant backlash. And of course, one of the interesting aspects about radio in the early days is what did the listeners think? And how did the radio industry know what people thought? In the early days, it was letters. They encouraged people to write letters about the content. And people did write a lot of letters to the radio station. By the 1930s, you start to get a more scientific approach of calling people on the phone, sampling, trying to get a better idea who listened. But when radio came under criticism, some of the people in the industry weren't too happy about the people who were criticizing it. Roy Durston, who was one of the principals of the great BBDO advertising firm, he insisted that radio filled the needs of radio-typical listeners. A very tired, bored, middle-aged man or woman whose lives are empty and who have exhausted their outside sources of amusement when they took a quick look at the evening newspaper. And this is kind of an interesting phenomenon too in this period. This idea of the masses. In the cultural world, there's this idea that the great bulk of people are kind of an individual, a homogenized mass. And they're not very interesting, they're not very smart. They're just like Roy Dorstein explained them. They're just kind of very dull, not interesting people. In fact, there was a very famous book written by a Spanish philosopher in 1929 called The Revolt of the Masses. And what he argued in that book is the masses think they have their own culture. They think they know things. High culture is really what's important. The masses should be looking up to us. They shouldn't be going after jazz, this degenerate form of music. They should be listening. They should realize that classical music is really the good thing. So there is this whole concept of the masses in the 1920s and 30s. And Durston said, who are the people who are criticizing radio? Well, they're people with full lives, with books to read, with parties to attend, with theaters to visit, with friends whose conversational powers are interesting. Radio provides a vast source of delight and entertainment for the barren lives of millions. Pretty arrogant. The NBC president, Aylesworth, echoed Durston. The most bitter critic of radio, he said, is the recluse, the intellectually superior person who voluntarily separates himself from the living, breathing, moving America in which he lives. These folk do not belong to the great, vibrant mass and soul of America. So one of the things that they ended up doing was analyzing all the letters that were sent in to determine how smart and educated the people who sent the letters were. CBS claimed that of 10,000 listeners to the American School of the Air, the networks did put on some education programming to basically undermine the education stations. They threw a little bit out there. So they had the American School of the Air. They said that 80% of their letters came from persons of a high order of intelligence. NBC even sorted letters by the type of paper, the grammar, and the spelling. But the famous historian Will Durant was asked to study another sampling, and he inferred that most of the letters came from invalids, lonely people, the very aged, the very youthful, hero worshippers, and mischievous children were the people who listened to radio. And of course, another interesting aspect of this new medium is that new media seem to disorient people. Even going back to the printed book, when books came out, there was a lot of weird stuff that was printed. One of my favorite one was the acephalous Native Americans in America who didn't have heads, but they had their face and everything on their stomach. You could, once books became cheap, right? And so you could print anything, right? Same thing happens with radio, and of course, the most famous episode here was when they broadcast the War of the Worlds as a radio drama, even though they warned people and told them before and after that it was just a dramatization. The nation went into a panic because they really thought Martians were landing in New Jersey. And of course, a lot of people wondered why New Jersey. Really? Would the Martians really want to pick New Jersey? And kind of an interesting sidelight to this, a couple weeks after this radio drama, the DuPont company at the New York World's Fair announced that nylon, and they said that nylon was made from coal, air, and water. Magic, right? The modern technology, wasn't Arthur Clarke said that any advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic to the average person. And of course, there's the political uses of radio, right? As we know, new media provide different ways to connect with people, and also the number of people you connect with. In the 1928 election, Herbert Hoover was a very old-fashioned politician. And of course, in the old days, a lot of times a politician's strength and virility were on how long they could talk. And I always think, you ever see these big pictures of like Teddy Roosevelt and people with these giant crowds? There were no microphones. How in the world could people, they must have had great voices to be able to yell out and be able to talk to a large crowd. Well, Herbert Hoover took the same approach to radio, and also how long he could speak. On Tuesday, October 4th, 1932, at 8:30 p.m., Herbert Hoover went on the air to give a speech about the upcoming election. And here's, listeners confidently awaited the president's concluding remarks. Confidently and also impatiently, for at 9:30, Mr. Ed Wynn comes on the air. Mr. Hoover had only arrived at point 2 of his 12-point program. The populace shifted in its myriad seats. Wives looked at husbands. Children allowed to remain up till 10 o'clock on Tuesdays looked in alarm at the clock. 20,000 votes shifted to Franklin Roosevelt. At 9:45, Hoover had arrived at point 4. 2 million Americans switched off their instruments and sent their children to bed weeping. In New York alone, station WEAF was pelted with 800 phone protests, and another station was swamped by 6,000 telephone calls complaining about. So, but Roosevelt, of course, as we know, came up with a very intriguing and effective way of communicating to the American people, realizing that people listen to their radios in their home, in their living room, and Roosevelt adopted this style of talking to people as if he were sitting there with them. His first one, of course, in 1933, shortly after he took office, talking to people about the banking crisis and why it shut down the banks and how they were going to reopen the banks. And this talk really took down the level of panic, and people started putting their money back in the banks shortly after Roosevelt gave this talk. And of course, throughout Roosevelt's time as president, he was able to communicate with the American people rather effectively through his fireside chats. But there are also, media are neutral. Can be used for many purposes. In the United States in the 1930s, two radio demagogues, Huey Long of Louisiana, who basically ended democracy in Louisiana, and Father Coughlin, who was basically Adolf Hitler's mouthpiece in the United States, drew huge radio audiences. And this is from a book about these guys and how their rhetoric espoused faith in simple solutions and blamed Wall Street financiers, wealthy industrialists, corrupt politicians. Their rhetorical style sought the submission of the audience to the rhetoric by undermining the individual auditor's capacity for free thought and individual expression. The over-identity of the audience, capture the audience in a cult of unthinking affirmation, and to systematically incapacitate the audience's intellect so as to disable their ability to question. And of course, radio was the great means of there. And unfortunately, there was another guy who found radio to be quite useful, and that was Adolf Hitler. In the 1930s, his minister of production, Albert Speer, wrote in his very interesting memoir, Inside the Third Reich, Hitler employed to perfection the instruments of technology to dominate its own people. By means of such means of technology as the radio and public address systems, 80 million persons could be made subject to the will of one individual. And his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, said, real broadcasting is true propaganda. Means fighting on all battlefields of the spirit, generating, multiplying, destroying, exterminating, building, and undoing. Our propaganda is determined by what we call the German race, blood, and nation. So, I think that's pretty much my thing. I don't want to end on such a dire note there, but I guess the point here is that with media, we should be suspicious of media. We should not accept everything we hear and see on media. We need to remain skeptical. Media can be used to present information or misinformation in many different ways. And we do have a weakness, I think, to be disoriented by new media. And it's something I think we need to fight against. And be skeptical. Be skeptical of everything you see, hear, and read is about the only message I can end with. All right, thank you.
Germans produced radios that could only receive one frequency and distributed it.
What?
In Germany at that time, they distributed radios to the public that could only receive one frequency.
Yes. Oh, yeah, yes.
Which was the station they wanted you to listen to.
Yeah.
And they outlawed tunable radios.
Yeah, they outlawed tuning, yes. In the really interesting book, Midnight in Chernobyl, there's in the Ukraine during the Soviet era, people had radios in their houses, and they were supposed to be on 24 hours a day. And it was just constant Soviet propaganda.
I went to Russia and people had wired systems and like turned web station, government station.
Yeah, but people are usually pretty clever, right? I mean, in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union, people were able to subvert. They were able to subvert. The authorities and try to tap into other sources of information.
Same with the internet. Same with the internet. Recently the Soviets, turned off certain ports of the internet.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a constant battle, right, between information becoming incredibly available to everyone, and other people are not liking the idea that everybody, and trying to narrow the options that people have, and not let them have information. I just one really interesting. After World War II, Vannevar Bush, the guy who ran all the American R&D programs during the war that produced the atom bomb and radar and synthetic rubber and penicillin and DDT, he came up with the idea of an internet that was based on microfilm. So it's really interesting. He had the idea in 1945 that we were going to make all information available to everybody, and we're going to do it with microfilm. And so everybody in their house would just have a wall full of microfilm, but of course the idea is that what happened is that people hate microfilm. It's not easy to use. People hate microfilm readers, but Bush had the idea of the internet. He just had the wrong technology in 1945. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's clear that history repeats itself over and over and over. And if we taught the history of radio or the history of broadcasting in elementary school, we might have smarter voters and electorate. We might have a more aware, population.
Yeah. Well, I just think, to me, it's just, having taught college for 35 years, to me, it's just, it's analytical thinking. It's the ability to, and even, just when you have kids read a document in a class, and then you say to them, okay, what's this person trying to do to you? What's the point? What are they trying to tell you on this document? Can you deconstruct the argument here? They have a hard, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing for them to do. And I'm not sure what the best way to teach it is, but people just have to be critical and think for themselves. The other thing is, don't think you're stupid, I guess. Don't think that the other people are going to tell you what's true. Think for yourself. Don't just say, okay, yeah, well, they said it. Well, it must be true. No. There is such thing as logic. There are ways to approach information to try to figure out whether what you consider its validity, or whether it's a legitimate argument, or whether it's just nonsense. Anything else?
This has been wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Don, we appreciate you sharing your expertise
Oh boy,
and
goodies.
knowledge and humor with us
Yes.
too. So
Goodies.
this is a little goodie
Goodies.
bag for you and for the grandkids.
Oh, wow. Are there stickers in